My own daughter laughed when I asked her about my room. The same room I'd carefully built over decades, filling it with memories, love, and everything I held dear. That laugh? It wasn't just a joke. It was a spark that ignited a quiet storm inside me. I didn't yell. I didn't confront her in that moment. Instead, I stood there, breathing deeply, and made a silent decision. If she thought she could treat my life's work like a punchline, she would soon understand the mistake she had made. I'm Mateo, 53 years old, and I've spent every year of my life ensuring my family had more than I ever did. This house isn't just walls and a roof. It's decades of sweat, memories, and the laughter of my late wife echoing through the hallways. When my daughter Clara called 2 years ago, her voice trembled with worry. Her husband, Paul, had lost his job unexpectedly. Rent was overdue, bills were stacking, and their little boy, Liam, barely 5 at the time, was too young to understand what was happening. I didn't hesitate. "Of course you can stay," I told her, my voice steady, my heart wanting to embrace them. This was your home too, I thought, and I meant it. I remembered the house when Clara was a child. The wide porch she loved to swing on, the garden where her mother planted roses in every color, the kitchen filled with smells of Sunday dinners. Every corner had a story, every floorboard a memory. At first, having them here felt right. The sound of Liam running down the stairs, Clara's laughter in the mornings, Paul's quiet presence in the evenings. It was a house alive again. But slowly, the place I had built for myself began to feel less like mine. It started subtly. They asked if they could use the larger upstairs bedroom because it was closer to the bathroom. I agreed, thinking it was practical. But then boxes started appearing in the closets, boxes that weren't mine. My dresser was moved, my belongings shifted, and then, one ordinary afternoon, I asked the question that would change everything. "Clara, where's my room now?" She laughed, just like that, with no thought, no hesitation. And in that instant, the warmth of our home turned cold. I realized something I hadn't expected. My generosity had been mistaken for weakness. And in that quiet, shocking moment, I knew that things had to change. Before I reveal what I did next, I want you to imagine this. Your child, the one you raised, treating your lifelong sanctuary like a punchline. What would you do? After that laugh, the house felt different, like a stranger had taken residence where my memories once lived. I didn't confront Clara, and I didn't argue. I simply walked through the rooms I had built with my own hands, touching the familiar surfaces, noticing the subtle changes that now felt like intrusions. The scent of the roses her mother had planted years ago still lingered in the garden, but inside, the place I'd called home was slowly slipping through my fingers. At night, I lay awake listening to the quiet sounds of them in the other rooms, the soft thud of Leon's sneakers on the stairs, the murmur of conversation from the bedroom that used to be mine. I remembered every corner, the way sunlight would hit the floor at dawn, the scratch on the door frame where Clara had measured her height as a child, the small nook by the fireplace where I kept my old books. And now, all of it felt borrowed, temporary, as though my presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. It wasn't about space or comfort anymore. It was about respect. I realized that the room wasn't just four walls. It was a symbol of my life's work, the life I had built to protect my family. And in that moment, I understood that kindness without boundaries could be mistaken for weakness. I thought of the countless nights I had spent fixing the roof, painting the walls, and polishing the floors. I thought of my late wife's careful touch in every corner, of her laughter echoing in the halls. This house was sacred to me, and Clara's laughter had desecrated that sanctity. The next morning, I acted calmly, deliberately. I went through the house quietly, as though I were conducting a careful inspection, noting which locks were old, which doors could be reinforced. Each step I took was measured, careful, almost ritualistic. There was no anger in my movements, only a steady, simmering resolve. I knew she wouldn't suspect a thing. After all, she had treated my presence here as a given, as though I were merely a background character in her life. But by the end of the day, I would reclaim what was mine, not with shouts or accusations, but with quiet precision. Before I carried out what I had planned, I paused and looked at Liam playing in the garden. My grandson's laughter reminded me of why I had welcomed them in the first place. This wasn't about punishment. It was about boundaries, about respect. And Clara would learn, in the calmest way possible, that her father's home was not hers to laugh at. By the time she returned from running errands that evening, everything had changed, though the house appeared unchanged. The air was the same, the roses still bloomed, and yet the balance had shifted. I was ready, and I was certain. She didn't know that when she opened that door, she would step into a home where her father's word was final, and my quiet storm had only just begun. Before I continue, tell, from which place are you watching this story right now? Please subscribe and like the video for motivation. When Clara and Paul stepped back through the front door that evening, nothing seemed amiss. The familiar creak of the porch, the faint scent of the roses in bloom, even the soft glow of the hallway light, they all whispered comfort. Yet beneath the surface, the air was charged with a quiet tension they couldn't perceive. I watched them from the kitchen, my hands folded calmly, my face unreadable. Liam ran past me laughing, oblivious to the invisible shift in the household. I had spent the afternoon carefully changing the locks, making sure each one was replaced without a sound, without a trace of intrusion. When she called out to ask about the new sound on the front door, I merely smiled and said, "Everything's fine." And in that moment, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her face, subtle but unmistakable. It was the same hesitation I had felt years ago when she had first learned that life wasn't always predictable. And now, after decades of raising her and opening my home to her family, she was beginning to understand that even the most generous hearts have limits. The days that followed were quiet, almost unnervingly so. Clara tiptoed through the hallways, the sense of entitlement she once carried so casually, now tempered by subtle caution. Paul kept to the living room, quietly reading, avoiding the subtle power shift he had not anticipated. And yet, I never raised my voice, never made a single accusation. My presence alone, calm and unyielding, was enough to convey the message. At night, I would sit in the study, listening to Liam's soft breathing upstairs, remembering the years I had spent building this home, maintaining it, and loving it. I thought of my late wife, of the life we had carved together, and I understood that my actions were not just about asserting authority. They were about preserving legacy. Every lock I had changed, every small alteration I had made, was a reminder that respect was earned, not demanded. And then, one evening, Clara lingered in the doorway of what used to be my room, her expression hesitant, almost apologetic. She didn't speak, she simply looked, as though seeing the space through new eyes. The unspoken tension filled the room, a quiet storm of realization settling over her. She was beginning to understand, at last, that some things in life, some places, some hearts, cannot be treated lightly. By the time she closed the door behind her and retreated to the living room, I felt a sense of calm satisfaction. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't shouted, I hadn't needed to. And yet the lesson had been quietly delivered through the subtle power of presence, preparation, and unwavering resolve. But even as the night grew still, I knew this was only the beginning. The next chapter of this quiet reclamation would test patience, loyalty, and understanding in ways Clara had not yet imagined. The following days stretched into a rhythm I had not anticipated, a rhythm dictated by the subtle authority I now held within my own home. Clara moved cautiously, as if the walls themselves were observing her every step. Paul, once confident and oblivious, began to mirror her hesitancy, sensing the invisible shift without understanding its source. And yet I never had to raise my voice, never made a single accusation. My presence alone, calm and unyielding, was enough to convey the message. At night, I would sit in the study, listening to Liam's soft breathing upstairs, remembering the years I had spent building this home, maintaining it and loving it. I thought of my late wife, of the life we had carved together, and I understood that my actions were not just about asserting authority. They were about preserving legacy. Every lock I had changed, every small alteration I had made was a reminder that respect was earned, not demanded. And then, one evening, Clara lingered in the doorway of what used to be my room, her expression hesitant, almost apologetic. She didn't speak, she simply looked, as though seeing the space through new eyes. The unspoken tension filled the room, a quiet storm of realization settling over her. She was beginning to understand, at last, that some things in life, some places, some hearts, cannot be treated lightly. By the time she closed the door behind her and retreated to the living room, I felt a sense of calm satisfaction. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't needed to. And yet, the lesson had been quietly delivered through the subtle power of presence, preparation, and unwavering resolve. But even as the night grew still, I knew this was only the beginning. The next chapter of this quiet reclamation would test patience, loyalty, and understanding in ways Clara had not yet imagined. The following days stretched into a rhythm I had not anticipated, a rhythm dictated by the subtle authority I now held within my own home. Clara moved cautiously, as if the walls themselves were observing her every step. Paul, once confident and oblivious, began to mirror her hesitancy, sensing the invisible shift without understanding its source. And yet I never had to raise my voice, never had to confront them directly. My presence alone, calm, deliberate, unwavering, carried the weight of decades spent building this home, maintaining it, and protecting it from intrusion. I spent my mornings tending to the garden, carefully pruning the roses that my late wife had planted, each flower a memory, each stem a connection to the life we had built together. I walked the halls slowly, touching familiar surfaces, opening drawers that were still mine, letting my hands linger over the grain of the wood, the smooth polish of the floors. Every detail mattered. Every small ritual reinforced my claim to the life I had nurtured and the home that had once been the heart of my family. Clara's laughter no longer echoed through the halls as freely as before. It had been replaced with cautious conversation, her voice softer, more deliberate. She asked permission for small things now, rather than assuming access. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to an outsider, but to me it was everything. She was beginning to understand that respect is not a gift, it is earned and preserved. And in the quiet moments, when she thought I wasn't listening, I could feel her hesitation, the small flicker of realization in her tone that the house was not hers to claim at whim. Liam continued to run through the rooms, his presence a reminder of innocence untainted by the adult misunderstandings around him. I watched him one afternoon, his small hands brushing against the polished wood of the railing, his laughter unburdened, and I felt a soft warmth in my chest. This was why I had welcomed them in the first place. The boundaries I was now establishing were not born of anger, but of necessity. For them to thrive, and for my home to remain what it had always been, some lines could not be crossed. Paul tried to assert himself a few times, asking questions about certain rooms, hinting at desires to rearrange, to make the house more convenient for their stay. I answered calmly, each response measured and precise. Nothing harsh, nothing confrontational, yet each answer carried the invisible weight of authority. A simple, "We'll leave that as it is for now," or "That room will remain as it has always been," shifted the dynamic entirely. They realized that I was not a passive host to be taken for granted, but the steward of a legacy that demanded respect. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the floors, Clara lingered in the hallway longer than usual, her eyes falling on the spaces that once seemed hers for taking. I noticed the subtle tightness in her shoulders, the hesitant tone in her voice as she asked about minor household tasks. She was testing herself, perhaps, trying to see if she had overstepped. And in that silence, in the quiet between questions and answers, I felt the full weight of my victory. Not in anger, not in confrontation, but in presence, in calm authority, and in the understanding that sometimes silence speaks louder than words. I realized then that this was not just about the room or even the house. It was about boundaries, about respect, about ensuring that the people I loved most understood the value of the life I had built for them and with them. And while it had begun with Clara's laugh, it had grown into something larger, a lesson in responsibility, in humility, and in the quiet power of a man who knows what is his and will protect it without compromise. Yet even in this satisfaction, I felt a sense of anticipation. This was only part of the journey. The next steps would require careful observation, subtle adjustments, and patience. Clara and Paul had begun to understand, but there were still lessons to be learned, and the final chapter of this quiet reclamation had not yet been written. And I knew, deep down, that when the moment came, it would be unmistakable. A calm, deliberate demonstration of the respect my home demanded, and of the authority I had always carried within it. The mornings grew quieter, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. Clara and Paul moved about the house cautiously, speaking in softer tones, their movements deliberate. Even Liam seemed to sense a subtle shift, though his innocence kept his laughter free and light. I watched them carefully, noting every gesture, every hesitation. Each small action was a reminder that the household had changed. My home, once a place of casual familiarity, had become a space defined by boundaries and respect. One afternoon, Clara lingered near the doorway of what had always been my room. She hesitated, her hand brushing against the frame as if testing whether the space still belonged to her. I didn't speak, didn't react. My presence alone, steady and calm, conveyed what words could not. In that silence, she seemed to understand, though perhaps only partially, that the life I had built, the home I had nurtured, was not hers to claim or to mock. Paul approached cautiously, attempting to negotiate trivial matters, shifting furniture, rearranging minor items, but each request met the same calm resistance. "We'll leave it as it is," I would say, my tone even, almost gentle, yet unyielding. No argument, no anger, just quiet authority. It was astonishing how quickly subtle firmness could transform entitlement into reflection. I could see the realization dawning on them both. Generosity has limits, and respect is non-negotiable. Evenings became moments of reflection for me. I would sit in the study, the soft glow of the lamp illuminating the polished floors, and remember the countless years spent building this home with my own hands. I thought of my late wife, her meticulous care, her laughter echoing through these walls, the countless Sunday afternoons spent with Clara and Liam in the garden. This was not about punishment. It was about preservation, about teaching lessons that words alone could not convey. Then came the moment that truly tested them. I had prepared the house meticulously, making subtle changes they would notice without realizing immediately. A locked drawer here, a shifted key there, the gentle but undeniable reminder that their father's home was not theirs to command. That evening, Clara paused at the threshold of my former room, glancing toward the lock she had previously ignored. Her eyes met mine for a fleeting moment, a mixture of hesitation, surprise, and perhaps the first hints of understanding. I smiled quietly, as if nothing had changed, yet the unspoken message had already reached her. Liam, unaware of the undercurrents around him, ran past, his laughter filling the room. I felt a swell of warmth, knowing the lessons were not just for the adults, but for the boy growing up in this home. Respect, patience, understanding, these were lessons I hoped he would carry, long after the moment had passed. And as Clara and Paul finally retreated to the living room, subdued and reflective, I realized that the quiet reclamation of my home had succeeded far beyond my expectations. The authority I never needed to shout was now unmistakable, delivered through presence, preparation, and unwavering resolve. But even in this quiet victory, I knew the story was not yet complete. There were still boundaries to maintain, lessons to reinforce, and moments to observe. The final chapter, where understanding would solidify and respect would no longer need reminders, was still ahead. And I felt ready, calm, and certain that when it came, it would leave no doubt in anyone's mind. This was my home, my life's work, and the rules here were mine to define. The days that followed carried a new rhythm, one shaped entirely by the quiet power I now held within my home. Clara and Paul had grown accustomed to subtle boundaries, and yet the weight of their previous disregard lingered, a faint tension beneath the surface. I watched them from a distance, observing the way their steps had slowed, the way their voices now carried a note of consideration I had not heard before. Even the smallest movements, the way Clara paused before opening a drawer, the way Paul checked the locks he had once ignored, spoke volumes about the shift that had quietly taken hold. I spent my mornings as I always had, tending to the garden, repairing small things around the house, and moving deliberately through the spaces that were mine. Every action, every careful adjustment reinforced a single truth. Respect is earned, not demanded. Liam's laughter filled the hallways, a reminder of innocence untainted by past mistakes, and I allowed myself a small smile. He had no role in the conflicts of the adult world, and yet through observation alone, he was beginning to understand the dynamics of care, authority, and respect. One afternoon, Clara approached the study where I sat quietly reading, a question on her lips that she hesitated to ask. Her hand rested lightly on the doorframe, and for a moment I could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the faint shadow of guilt, the recognition of how she had taken my generosity for granted. "Matteo," she began, her voice soft, careful. I looked up at her calmly, not a flicker of anger crossing my face. She paused, swallowed, and finally said, "I didn't realize." She trailed off, the words incomplete, but the message unmistakable. She had finally begun to grasp the depth of what had transpired. The quiet reclamation of a father's home, executed without confrontation, but with undeniable authority. Liam, observing from the living room, shifted uneasily, the first true sign that my measured response had reached him as well. He approached slowly, nodding in acknowledgement without needing to speak aloud. The house had changed, and they both sensed it. The laughter that once filled the rooms with entitlement had been replaced by careful consideration, by subtle understanding. I could feel the lesson taking root, the silent understanding that some things, some places, some hearts cannot be treated lightly. And then finally, the moment I had anticipated with quiet patience arrived. Clara stood at the doorway of my former room, pausing to look around, her expression reflective, tinged with humility. She did not speak. She simply absorbed the space, the quiet order, the subtle signs that this house was no longer hers to control. She understood now, without a single raised voice or argument, that her father's home was sacred, shaped by years of effort, care, and love, and in that understanding, a bridge between respect and gratitude quietly formed. As night fell, I sat by the window, listening to Liam's soft breathing upstairs and the faint murmur of conversation below. The house was calm, filled with the gentle energy of a family learning, slowly but surely, the meaning of respect. I reflected on my journey, the decision to act quietly, deliberately, without anger, and the satisfaction of seeing lessons take root where confrontation had never succeeded. And in that stillness, I knew that my home, my legacy, and the memories I had nurtured for decades were now secure.
But even in this quiet triumph, a sense of anticipation lingered. The final chapter was still to come, a resolution that would cement understanding, restore balance completely, and leave no doubt about the authority and love that had built this home. And I was ready, patient and unwavering, knowing that the conclusion would arrive with the same calm certainty that had guided me all along. The morning light spilled through the windows, illuminating the house in a gentle glow, but nothing about the day felt ordinary. Clara moved quietly, her usual hurried gestures tempered by careful consideration. Paul remained attentive, his attempts to assert control now replaced by thoughtful observation. Even Liam seemed to sense the shift, skipping lightly across the floors with a freedom that was innocent, yet informed by the subtle lessons unfolding around him. The house, my home, breathed in a calm authority that had not been there before, a presence felt without being spoken aloud. I walked through the room slowly, my hands grazing the polished surfaces, taking in every detail, the smooth floors, the sturdy furniture, the small signs of care I had cultivated for decades. My eyes lingered on the bedroom doors, once a source of contention, now reminders of boundaries restored. This house, built with sweat and love, maintained not by confrontation, but by presence, had reclaimed its rightful order. I thought of my late wife and the countless Sundays spent tending the roses, of laughter shared across the hallways, and I felt a profound sense of fulfillment. Clara approached me that evening, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of humility and acknowledgement. She didn't speak immediately, but in the quiet pause I could see that the lessons had taken hold. "Matteo," she said softly, her voice edged with sincerity, I understand now. I didn't realize what I took for granted." I nodded, my expression calm, gentle, but firm. That single moment, without argument, without raised voices, was worth more than any confrontation could have achieved. The respect I had quietly restored was now visible in her posture, in the careful way she moved, in the reverence in her gaze toward the house I had built. Paul stood beside her, a silent acknowledgement passing between us, the understanding that authority paired with patience and measured action carries more weight than anger ever could. Liam's laughter, light and carefree, echoed through the halls once again, unburdened by adult tensions, a reminder that the future of this home, of the lessons of respect and care, was now in safe hands. I sat in the study, looking out the window at the garden bathed in golden light. The roses bloomed in vibrant colors, each petal a testament to the time, effort, and love poured into this home. I realized then that this journey had not been about punishment. It had been about teaching, about preserving, about showing that generosity has limits and that respect must be earned quietly, deliberately, and without need for confrontation. Clara and Paul had learned the lesson, not through anger, but through the subtle, unwavering presence of a father protecting his legacy. And in that understanding, the home had returned to its natural order, safe, respected, alive with the quiet balance of authority and love. I smiled, knowing that for the first time in many months, the house felt fully mine again, yet still a home for the family I had always wanted to protect. As I watched Liam run freely across the hallway, I knew that respect, love, and boundaries had all found their place. This house, this life, this legacy I had built with my own hands was intact. And in that quiet triumph, I felt a deep sense of peace, the knowledge that my family had finally understood that some things, some places, some hearts cannot be treated lightly. And as night settled over the home, calm and serene, I knew with certainty that the lessons learned here would echo through this house for generations to come.